Okay, hello Dan.
Hello, how are you, Ida?
Very nice to see you.
Thank you.
Dan Connell, you're professor
Yes.
in...
In Boston, I am a visiting scholar at the African Studies Center at Boston University.
You've been teaching for many years?
12 years teaching. This began when I left Eritrea in 2002. Before that, I was working there assisting for almost 2 years with the information ministry, and before that I'd been writing books and doing research on Eritrea and also on other countries where there were political and social movements for change. South Africa, Nicaragua, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, the Philippines, and so on.
Yes, you're a very known person to Eritrea.
Thank you.
What was your first contact with Eritrea?
The first time I went to, well, the first contact I had with Eritreans was in 1975 in Khartoum when I was traveling for my first time in Africa, and I met young Eritreans at the hostel, youth hostel in Khartoum. After that I went to Ethiopia. I met Eritreans in Addis and learned more about the country, and that inspired me to try to get in. And so I went north from Addis in April of 1976 and managed to get all the way into Tigray, where I met two Eritreans who were driving back to Asmara, people who worked for the telecommunications office. And they agreed to take me and my friend in with them, and so I went to Asmara for the first time. I saw their very terrible massacre. I wrote about it for the Washington Post. I then came across the border to Sudan, where I met the ELF and the EPLF, and I arranged to go into the field for the first time, and I spent almost 5 weeks traveling, first with EPLF and then with ELF. Into the areas behind the lines. From the other side I had seen when I was in Asmara, and I've been going back ever since until 2002 when Naisgi Kiflu closed the door on me and said time was up. I had said things that were not permitted and I would have to leave.
Did he say verbally or by paper?
No papers. The first message I got when I had an apartment in the Sembal Apartments, Korea, and I was traveling home to take care of my family business and then back and forth. And one time when I came home, I got a message saying, "You're finished, don't come back." I got on a plane and went back anyway. And I had an apartment, I had things to do, I had a project to work on there, I was not finished. So I went back and I sat down with Naisgi in his office in the Ministry of Information, because by then he had taken over that post, and he was the one who had shut down the press and would later shut down the churches that were banned in the country. And he also shut me down. The irony was that Naisgi was the person who met me in Port Sudan on my very first trip to Meda, to the field in 1976. So it went full circle.
Really?
But he said verbally to me in his office, with a big smile on his face, that I had crossed the line and would not be permitted to stay.
Did he say the reason?
Well, it was because of an interview I did with Asmarino, criticizing the arrest of the G15 and arguing that if they had committed a crime, they should be taken to court and tried for it, and not just disappeared. And that, together with the closing of the newspapers, I thought was not healthy for Eritrea, and I disagreed with it, and that was enough.
But you had very close contact with the EPLF.
Yes, for many years, from 1976 until that moment. I still have contact with members of the EPLF, many of whom have left.
Yeah. But in 1976 you said something, some massacre. What happened?
Well, it was Colonel Beshu who had been the military commander of the garrison in Asmara. He was assassinated outside the bar of Nebiat when she, working with the EPLF, drew him into an ambush, and he was killed. And the response of the Ethiopians was to go all around the city shooting at everything, and then finally to go quietly around with a list of supporters of the liberation movements, and taking people out of the house and executing them. So it was a series of executions.
But it was okay for a foreigner.
Well, it was not exactly okay. There were no journalists permitted there, so there were no stories ever about Eritrea at this time, at least from inside. I snuck in, basically, and I went at one point to the American consulate to register, which is what you're supposed to do for protection, and they were completely shocked. It was, what are you doing here? But I stayed there for 1 week, and then I flew back to Aksum and I went by bus and truck, actually, the Eritrea, hitchhiking, back to Addis, and I went from Addis to Khartoum and into the field. So, and I didn't go back to Ethiopia until 1987 for the first time.
Okay, in the dark time.
I did. In 1987, I was the director of a small NGO called Grassroots International, which was sending aid to Eritrea and also Tigray through REST. And I was asked by Jesse Jackson, the politician, the African-American politician in the U.S., for Grassroots to sponsor a trip to the Middle East and Africa. And he was going to make a very big statement about the continued threat of hunger in northern Ethiopia and Tigray. I thought it would be a good opportunity to be close to him to talk to him about Eritrea as well. And so I agreed to do it. And we flew to the Gulf, to Kuwait together with a big delegation. And unfortunately, while we were in Kuwait, a very close friend of his, another African-American politician in the U.S. named Harold Washington, who was then the mayor of the city of Chicago.
So you entered Addis Ababa with nobody, nothing happened.
But I never was able to get to Tigray, and of course Jesse Jackson was not there, so the main purpose of the trip was blocked. But the next time I went to Ethiopia was in the early 90s, when I flew back to Asmara with my wife for a visit. And there were no direct flights into Asmara at that point, so we had to fly to Addis and stay overnight. And we stayed in the piazza in Addis in a little hotel, and then went up to Asmara. I was back again in the mid-90s, an assignment for Human Rights Watch to study the arms trade in the area, in Sudan particularly. And this was largely because Osama bin Laden had been based in Sudan, and the Sudanese government was supporting guerrilla groups, and particularly jihadist groups, around that whole region, including the Eritrean Islamic Jihad, the EIJ. And so we, two of us on a team, went to look at the kinds of weapons that were moving through this whole area. So I went to Eritrea and to the border area there. I went also to Ethiopia and had a chance then in 1997 to meet with Meles Zenawi. He had an interview for me. And then we went up to Bahir Dar and into the border area, and we crossed into Sudan with the Sudan Alliance forces. I had a chance then to see a little more of Ethiopia. It was, of course, very different with the Derg gone, and we were free to travel. My friend and I, my partner on this project, working on this, had some time also when we had security issues crossing the border. So we drove in a little Land Rover all the way up to Lalibela, by ourselves, visited the area, and then drove back. That was an interesting time. I have been back to Ethiopia again in 2012 to visit the refugee camps up in the Shire area, and again I met with Melis in Addis at that time, and then went up to Shire and went to Shemelba, Ma'ani, Adi Harush, and met with the Eritrean refugees who were up there. And of course each time it was quite different, but in 2012 I also had a free chance to move about at will and see the situation and see the refugees as part of an ongoing project now that I've been doing ever since, to look at the condition of Eritrean refugees everywhere that I could find them, and to try to get a good idea of the overall experience of these thousands of people who have been leaving the country in the last 10 years.
Yes, so you know the why they are leaving the country.
Well, they tell many stories of why they're leaving. I think often national service is one of the big drivers, and this is why so many who leave are young people. It's not often that people object to national service as a principle. In fact, I've had many young people say this is a duty to serve your country. Many countries have a national service. And in fact, the United States used to have one, and I think we should have another one. But a national service that is both endless when you get called and abusive when you're in it is the reason that people cite that they leave. And I mentioned both those things. One is the indefinite character of it. I met a person recently in Washington who had just come from Eritrea, and he had been in national service for almost 18 years. He was one of the very first people to go in for 18 months, which he did quite happily. He was called back to the war in 1998, and again he felt that that was his duty because the country was threatened. But in 2000 he was then assigned to be a teacher, and he was paid so little that his parents had to subsidize him so that he could afford his transportation and his lodging. And that continued with small improvements in the pay, but still barely enough to live on, until 2014, when he finally had enough. And it's that kind of that sense that there's no future in your life that has caused many young people to flee. I've also heard many stories about people, though, who were bullied and abused and finally beaten and tortured when they did very small things that their commanding officer didn't like. And the picture that one gets from these many stories is a military that has lost its moral center, so that people at all levels, down to the Haile even, can mistreat members of their units, and there's no accountability, there's no punishment. And I think this is the problem that has now infused much of the society, that terrible abuses occur and there's no one you can go to for accountability. People aren't accused of mistreating others. They don't have any trials or places that you can go to complain, and if you do complain, the likely result is you'll end up disappearing into prison. So these two things, I think, are the main propellants of people out. It's the endless service and also the anarchic kind of abusive character of the state, basically, acting in particular through the military. I also hear, of course, very specific stories of people who get arrested because they are suspected of helping someone to escape. Often when they haven't done anything but had a friend who disappeared, and so the assumption is automatically, you must have known. So you're as guilty as the person who left. I talked to a woman recently, in fact, in Norway, just the other day, whose husband fled the military without her knowing. And the police came to her and interrogated her, and then finally she got a message from someone in the police that she was going to be arrested and put in prison because her husband had left. She immediately left as well. I've talked to other people who have been accused of participating in banned religious services, the so-called pentes, and they have left for that reason. So, in addition to the big drivers in the national service, the intolerance for asking questions at meetings, for participating in religious activities that the government doesn't permit, or in particular for assisting with anyone trying to leave. These are the things that seem to drive people out. I also often ask people, would you go back? And the answers vary in this, but for those who would go back, the things that they want to see are the limitations on national service, not the end, but the limitations, a rule of law, and a sense of accountability for misbehavior at all levels of the society up to the president. And to go along with that, of course, would be the release of the many political prisoners and the freedom to be open about one's ideas, points of view, and disagreements. So, limited national service, rule of law, and more freedom in the society. Whether that translates into a democracy like they would have in Sweden or the United States, I don't think is the crucial question. It's accountability and respect for rights.
Now that you mentioned the president, or so-called president, the dictator, you have known him so many years.
I have known Isaias since 1976.
What kind of a person was he? Is he?
Well, he was a much more relaxed and easygoing person when I first met him. I can remember watching him playing ping pong in Khartoum at the ERA office there, relaxed with people. I remember him in 1977 in Karen when it was liberated, just walking around the streets, having coffee and being at ease with the population. Over the years, he has gotten more and more removed, I think, from ordinary people, ordinary fighters, and ordinary citizens, and less tolerant of any difference with his own points of view. Not that he didn't have that tendency going all the way back, 1960s and 70s. He is clearly responsible for some brutal behavior toward people who opposed him. But in this kind of continuous way, again, over very small things, I think that this has developed to the point where he is now living in a kind of bubble, removed from the general society, and making increasingly poor decisions. And I think the decisions that he made during and after the border war were examples of this. Decisions that often seem to fit with his personality, but not with the interests and needs of the Eritrean people. And I'm not sure that he sees that there's a difference between his perspective and the nation. He now has assumed the role of the national standard bearer at the expense of anybody else's interests, needs, or points of view.
So he has to be removed.
I think that's up to the Eritrean people. But without that, I don't see much change in Eritrea.
You know the other persons around him also, Durru, Petros Solomon, and the others. You wrote a book about it, Conversation with the Prisoners.
I did.
It was before they were imprisoned.
Yes, they were not political prisoners at the time, but they knew they would be. When I started interviewing Durru, the very first conversation that's in that book was in 2000, and at that time there was already big debates going on inside the leadership over the character of the war, the hesitation and delays in implementing the Constitution, and other issues. And the tensions were building. This was before the third round of the war. After that, it got much more intense, and I began to think that the way the front, the EPLF, going all the way back to my first encounters with it, had operated was important to try to understand. And within that, the role of the secret party, the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. How was it that a front which had these open congresses that were actually being manipulated by a secret group, how was it that the habits of governance and rule within the Liberation Front carried over into the governing of the country itself? So I was asking questions about the EPRP, and that led me into more conversations with Duro, because he had had a very big role in that, of course. And I think that by then he was starting to look critically at his own blindness to some of the consequences of this approach, and was raising questions about it, and at the same time aware that the debates that had already gone inside the front were creating a kind of backlash from Isaias that was going to get to him at some point. So in January of 2001, the mid-levels of his own ministry and other ministries as well were having meetings by the PFDJ to begin to discredit the people in the leadership, those who had been raising questions inside the PFDJ, like Doro and Petros. So they saw from then on that things were going to come to a climax and a collision with Isaias. I think in the next 8 months, 9 months, they did what they could to try to get the analysis they had out, first through the open letter and then through interviews with the private press, and all the while they knew that this was going to end at some point with them going to prison. Many people wonder, why didn't they try to escape? I can only guess at that because no one answered that, but I think that to some extent they felt that this was their duty to the country to stay there until the end and to make their voices heard for a freer, more open society after all the sacrifices that people had made, and that if they had to make a sacrifice at the end of it by going into prison, that they would do so. And that's exactly what happened.
Yes. So you wrote the book about them?
The book I did was really just transcripts of the interviews. I put everything in there, even some of my own stupid questions sometimes, because I wanted this to be as real, as authentic in their voices, not in mine, as I could. And that book is really their voices. I was really only the vehicle.
Yeah. And did you know Bruno Stefanos?
Yes.
You knew him in Meda?
I knew him in Meda. I knew him in Zagreb when he was the person responsible for that whole area for the EPLF, for the mass organization, well, for the mass administration. And of course, I didn't know it at the time, but he was also active in the party, the EPRP.
He was a progressive man.
He was. But he and I have done some fighting on the internet through Twitter in recent times. And I'm sorry to see that happen, because I still have a great respect for what he has done over the years for the struggle and for the Eritrean people.
And you know also Ermias Papayo?
I do. I actually saw Ermias once in the hospital in Asmara. In, I think it was 2000, it might have been 2001, somewhere in there, where he was, of course, in prison, but he had been going through an illness, and he was moved to a military hospital right on the outskirts of the city. And I went in there with another friend of his who had access to there, and it was surprising in a way. We were able to just go into his room and have a conversation with him. And I remember he was still his good-spirited self, trying to make the best of his situation. He asked if there was any way we could to send him books, almost anything, just so he would have things to read. And that's the last I saw or heard of him.
Mm. And then his sister also, Sunlight, was taken.
Well, so many people have been taken since then.
Yes.
Sisters and wives and husbands and mothers and fathers, often for no reason other than they have a relative who has crossed the regime in some way.
Yeah, Petros Solomon and his wife.
Yes. Well, and I know the children, the twins, Hannah and Zarai, who are now in Boston, near where I live, after a terrible experience that they had to go through as well.
Yes. So this kind of leadership by Isaias, dividing and making each other enemy, it was an old pattern.
Well, it's a pattern that is not just unique to Eritrea. Of course, divide and rule is the tactic of conquerors and colonizers and dictators everywhere. How can a very small group of people control a very large group of people? Well, they do it by trying to turn them against each other. The only way to oppose that is to avoid those divisions and to unite people. And unfortunately, until now, the divisions within and among those who are critical of this regime have allowed this to continue. And they will allow it to continue until people can set aside their minor differences and find common ground. And in fact, if Eritrea is going to change in the future, those who consider themselves in opposition need to demonstrate very clearly now to the Eritrean people that there are ways for people with deep differences to coexist in a society without fighting with each other. And if they can't do it now, why should we think it would be any different in the future? We have many oppositions, dozens of oppositions. And I mean, I think in the end, the change when it comes in Eritrea will come from inside Eritrea. And those who are outside can participate in the reconstruction and perhaps in the support, but there will be a lot of work to do in the healing of the divisions and differences within Eritrea. And I think it would be a valuable thing to be thinking now about that.
Does the government of America know exactly what's going on?
I think the government of America is pretty aware, as are governments in other places. The question that many people have, of course, is where will this lead and what will come next? And I think it's very difficult to predict that when you look at the condition of those that oppose the government. I know also that in not just in Washington but in many capitals, the governments look at similar situations and they see Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, the places where there was an Arab Spring and a big uprising for democracy, but an incoherent alternative that was so divided that some very bad elements could end up emerging to either dominate or to so divide the society that no coherent, stable regime was possible. I think there's a great fear, rightly or wrongly, that this could happen in Eritrea. And once again, I think the only way that anyone will be convinced that's not the case is a demonstration of the ability to get along and to get things done among people of vast differences. You know, in Eritrea, you have people of differing religious and ethnic backgrounds. There are language issues and land issues still to be resolved. And there are different groups representing every one of those different interests. There's an enormous need for conversations among all those with grievance or a vision of the future to be talking to each other.
Well, the best book was Against All Odds.
Well, that's what they think in Asmara too. I think it's the only one that's legal.
Legally sold.
Yeah.
When was it written?
I wrote the first version of it in 1993, and I added a chapter and published a second edition in 97.
Okay. And then the next book was?
The next book was Rethinking Revolution, which was a comparison of the social and political movements in Eritrea, Palestine, Nicaragua, and let's see, South Africa. How could I forget? And after that, I did some small books. I actually edited a book for the Women's Union, Hamamite. No, and on the Congress that they held, I did a book for the Ministry of Information that was a country handbook. Ironic, that one. I don't think it's still distributed. One of the things that we talked about was the achievements of the movement up to 2000 when we were writing it, and predicting that there would be elections very soon. Still waiting, aren't we? I also did another edition of the Historical Dictionary of Eritrea in 2010, in which I attempted to reach out and include many more of the different narrative threads that make up Eritrea's history. Because, of course, there are many histories in Eritrea. There's that told within the EPLF circles, which I had been a big part of for many years. There are also the ELF versions of history. And then there are the people who were outside of both of those movements who have their own authentic experiences of Eritrea. And I'm not sure I captured them all, but I did my best to try to reach out. And I think the next steps in that are still to be taken and will be done by Eritreans in writing their own history. It's also, I think, worth saying that there are quite a number of really promising young Eritrean intellectuals now who are writing accounts of Eritrea's very rich culture and political history.
Okay. About the refugees, you traveled to Ethiopia, Sudan,
Israel, and Egypt. Yeah.
Also Sinai.
Egypt. Yeah.
Yes, I mean.
Yeah. And since 2012, I've been to all those places, including looking at the traffickers in the Sinai. And I have also interviewed refugees in North America and Canada and the U.S. and in Europe.
So a book will be published?
That would be my intention, yes. Another book still to come. So, and I hope that at some point we can have the party to celebrate the book and the end of this crisis in Asmara.
Yes, hopefully. Everybody will come back to Asmara.
I look forward to the day.
Be an honored guest.
Thank you.
Because you made Eritrea known in 1976, I remember. There was some article you wrote, it was a big thing for us.
Well, I did as much as I could in those years, and I started writing for different newspapers in Europe in particular, and a newspaper in the U.S. called The Guardian. Mm-hmm. I also wrote for the BBC and at times for the Voice of America, many different places.
You were almost the only foreign journalist who wrote about us.
Yes, but there have been others, and I hope that they will come back for the celebration in the future as well.
Yes, do you remember Christian Sabatier?
Yes, yes, very much. He's still in Paris, I think, now. He worked with the EPLF inside from before I was there. There's another, a Swedish writer who was in Eritrea before me. I don't know that he ever wrote any stories about it, but his name is Stieg Larsson. He is the author of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And he is very famous for his novels, but he also visited Eritrea in 1973.
He passed away.
Yes, he passed away. It's a great loss.
But Sabatier lives in France?
Sabatier lives in France. There are people from Belgium, from the UK, from Italy as well. And there are many who came during those years, during the struggle years. And then the government in Asmara seemed to make a break with all those people who had come in the past, but I don't think they ever forget. Eritrea leaves a very deep impression on those who become involved.